Should I start already?
Yeah.
Okay, again, I just want to express appreciation to Rabbi Ben-Zion Lazovsky for the help that he's giving in organizing the shiurim. Topic this week is Yom haShoah. This week is Yom haShoah and Holocaust Memorial Day. Now, many years ago, my father Zatzal was speaking at a Yom haShoah memorial event. I think it was in Brooklyn. And to a large degree, the speech that my father gave at that event was not just a speech, but it was a shiur. In the shiur, he discussed the two forms of the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, of sanctifying God's name, or dying in sanctification, because there are two mitzvahs of sanctification of God's name. One is dying in sanctification of God's name, and the other is in living in sanctification of God's name. And my father said that even in dying in sanctification of God's name, there are two separate mitzvahs of Kiddush Hashem. One is dying directly in sanctification of God's name, as many of those that were killed in the concentration camps and throughout the duration of World War II died in sanctification of God's name. But then there is a mitzvah of dying in sanctification of God's name through dying in sanctification of the name of the Jewish people. But the name of the Jewish people are connected with the name of God, because of Shmeinu Karasa B'Shmecha. My father mentioned that those who revolted at the Warsaw Uprising, they died in sanctification of the name of the Jewish people, and thereby they died in sanctification of God's name because of Shmeinu Karasa B'Shmecha. Our name you called in your name. Now, shortly after the shiur, or the speech that my father gave, my father received a telephone call from Rav Yitzchak Kutner, Hagon Rav Yitzchak Kutner, who was the Rosh Yeshiva for Rabbeinu Chaim Berlin, is one of the leaders of the Orthodox Jewish community in the United States. He was a member of the Moetzes Cholei Torah. And my father had a very close relationship with Rav Hutner. My grandfather did not send my father to Cheder when he was a young boy. My grandfather at that time lived in Warsaw, Poland. And my grandfather learned with my father Gemara himself, and Tanakh, my father learned with my grandmother, who knew all of Tanakh by heart. But then, when my grandfather left Europe for the United States, my grandmother and my father and the two sisters, my uncle was already in Berlin at that time, at the University of Berlin. So my grandparents made an arrangement with Rav Hutner, who had just left Chevron Yeshiva and came back to Warsaw, Poland. Rav Hutner at that time was 22 years old, and my father was 12 years old. And Rav Hutner became my father's teacher in Gemara. And they learned in that year Maseches Bava Kama, and they developed a very strong relationship throughout my father's life. He considered Rav Hutner one of his main rebbeim, even though they only learned together for 1 year. But that year had a major impact on my father's thinking. And my father was appointed by Reb Hutner when my father was very young, before he was married yet, to give his share in Chaim Berlin. At that time, he had the share, I think, below Reb Hutner. And even though their attitudes, attitudes concerning issues that face the Jewish community drifted apart, my father's respect and regard for Rav Hutner never waned. And a matter of fact, when my father would be invited to meetings of Rosh Yeshivas, he would almost always refuse to attend, because he was concerned that maybe Rav Hutner would be there and he would have a different opinion, and he would not want to disagree with the opinion of Rav Hutner. So, and Rav Hutner, and I can say that when Rav Hutner was taken hostage by the PLO, that duration of time, my father literally couldn't sleep at night. He would make telephone calls all over the world, making contacts with political leaders everywhere. In fact, he had a special telephone book, besides the regular telephone book that he kept with himself, that he kept himself with all the numbers he had to call for various different reasons. He had a special telephone book with the telephone numbers that he had to call to try to help Rav Hutner. And Rav Hutner also had these very strong, warm feelings about my father. And Rav Hutner at that time told my father that he had someone there at the shiur, at the speech that my father gave, who took notes and or wrote a transcript of my father's speech. And Rav Hutner said that the content of the speech was very good. He even mentioned that Reb Chaim could have said something like that. But he said, not on that day. And he said, just because the people in the Knesset, you have to understand, Reb Hutner later on was somewhat opposed to the Zionist movement. So just because the people in the Knesset proclaim a particular day as the Holocaust Memorial Day, as Yom haShoah, that doesn't mean that we have to speak on that day concerning the Shoah. He said, any other day of the year would be okay, but not on that day. And then he said that he told my father that even Menachem Begin, that was his expression. Even Menachem Begin says that the proper day to commemorate the Holocaust would be Tisha B'Av. Because Tisha B'Av, now, and then he added to my father, he says, don't let them use you. Okay, now my father disagreed with Rav Hutner, but my father, out of the deep respect and reverence he had for Rav Hutner, he didn't answer him. But the truth is that Tisha B'Av is the proper day. Tisha B'Av does not just commemorate the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, but Tisha B'Av, anybody that looks through the Kinnis sees that Tisha B'Av was established as a day of mourning and as a day of crying out to God because of all the events that took place since the time of the Churban, since the time of the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And we know that Tisha B'Av itself is a day that is a Yom Muchan Leperonios. And my father mentioned to me, actually he said in the speech, I was there, that he heard from his cousin, Rav Michal Feinstein, who was the son-in-law of the Brisker Rav. He was a cousin of my father on my father's side and on my mother's side. But so that Rav Michal Feinstein told my father that at one time there was a meeting, and this was toward the beginning, I guess, of the outbreak of World War II, and both Reb Chaim Ozer and Reb Elchanan Wasserman were at that meeting, and Reb Elchanan Wasserman, at that time, people understood that that there's going to be a lot of trouble for the Jewish people. They didn't realize the extent of it. They weren't prophets, but they already realized that there's going to be a lot of trouble. And Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman suggested that the tragedy that is going to take place will be greater than what happened at the Churban. And Reb Chaim Ozer took exception to that statement, and he said, how could the prat be bigger than the klal? In other words, whatever tragedy takes place, and there have been many tragedies that took place throughout 2,000 years of exile, it's all part and parcel of the Churban, of the destruction, of the exile. And it is because of this, to emphasize this point, that people should not see the tragedy as something separate from the exile, that Rav Hutner and many of the Gedolei Yisrael, the Brisker Rav, I think the Chazon Ish, they felt that it would be inappropriate to make a separate day to commemorate the tragedy of the Shoah, the tragedy of the Holocaust. And in truth, my uncle Zatzal was also against the establishment or the commemoration of Yom haShoah, and he felt that the proper time would be Tisha B'Av. As a matter of fact, my uncle, it was known, he used to give many shiurim on Tisha B'Av, on the Kinnis, every year. People would come from all over to attend this shiurim on the Kinnis. It wasn't to shir as a separate shir, but as he was saying the Kinnis, he would stop after every couple words to make comments. And he would always point out the similarities between what happened to the Jewish people at the beginning of the exile and to what happened to the Jewish people during World War II. My uncle was one of those who, at least initially, was very much opposed to the state of Israel taking money from Germany. I'm not saying one way or the other on that issue, but his feeling was that we have to include the commemoration for World War II, for the Jews that were killed in World War II, in the observance of Tisha B'Av. And he was opposed even to writing new kinnis. He felt it was important to associate the events mentioned in the kinnis with the events that took place during World War II. In the kinnis, they talk how women were tied to the tails of horses and were killed that way. And he mentioned how his cousin, my father's cousin, a grandson of Reb Chaim, and his wife, newly married wife, were both tied to the back of cars owned by Nazis, and these two cars raced at 70 miles an hour. And he gave many examples, similar examples. And when Ben Gurion from time to time would meet with my uncle when he came to the United States. And my uncle pointed out to him, and Ben Gurion questioned my uncle about his position regarding Yom haShoah, which was different than my father's position. And my uncle pointed out to him, and I've seen it mentioned that the Brisker Rav also mentioned this, not to Ben Gurion. Brisker Rav didn't meet with Ben Gurion, but it did the Kina Mi Yitain Roshi Mayim it's a Kina that was written during the first about the events of the first Crusades in Germany, about the three cities, Ashfira, Vermaisa, Magansitsa, so that the Jews were totally wiped out in those three cities. This Kina was written by Rabbeinu Kalonymus, who lived in one of these cities. My uncle suggests that there are those that disagree, but my uncle seems to think that Rabbeinu Kalonymus wrote the whole Kina, and somehow he survived the tragedy, and he wrote it when he sort of returned to look at the destruction after the Crusades. But in the Kina there it says, "V'chi ein lahosif moed sheba b'savera vein lahagzum zulasi lachra tachas kein hayom levisi ora." It's an English translation. However, we cannot make a day of mourning over ruin and conflagration, nor may we mourn earlier, only later. Instead, today on Tisha B'Av, I will arouse sorrowful wailing. In other words, that the way most people understand this Kina, they're saying that what happened during the Crusades is something that is worthy to have a day of fast, a day of mourning. But I can't add a day of mourning. And since I can't add a day of mourning, I will do it later, not earlier. And because of that, I have to, the day that I should say a Kina about what happened, the tragedy during the first Crusades, when the Christian soldiers on their way to Jerusalem slaughtered so many Jews. So the proper day would be on Tisha B'Av. But that explanation does not fit so well into that Kina. Because then what does he mean? Since I can't do it earlier, I'll do it later. What does that mean? My uncle suggests certain explanations, but I don't want to take too much time. I'll suggest that fits with his explanation, and I want to suggest another explanation. But my uncle said, Rabbeinu Kalonymus, who was the author of this Kina. So Rabbeinu Kalonymus felt that we cannot establish a day of mourning, a fast day every year for events, for tragedies that took place after the Korban. The proper time to do it would be on Tisha B'Av. However, but my uncle mentioned that we see from Rabbeinu Tam that Rabbeinu Tam had a different approach, because there was a city in the middle of France, Blois, Blois, in central France, and this is in the 1200s, I think. So there was a Jew who was by the river there, and he was watering his horse, and he noticed that there was a non-Jewish man who killed a non-Jewish child. And the murderer saw that the Jew observed what he did, and he was concerned that the Jew will report him to the authorities, and as a result of that, he might be executed for murder. So he quickly went to the head of the city, the person that was in charge, and he told them that the child was murdered, and murdered by the Jews. So the leader of the city took 31 Jewish leaders. I assume, because it's mentioned it was men and women, so it was the wives of some of the leaders, and it was assumed this was the first blood libel, which continued up to even into the 20th century. Apparently, this was shortly before Pesach, and it was suggested that the Jews killed the child in order to use his blood for matzahs. And these Jews 31 Jews were rounded up, and they were burnt at the stake. It's very interesting information is given over when they were tied and the fire was started. All 31 began saying Aleinu L'Shabeach. And somehow, depending how you read it, it's brought down in many different places. Some say that for some reason the fire did not burn them, and then the head of the city ordered the soldiers or whoever to kill them. Others say that the flames did kill them, but their bodies didn't burn. But whatever it was, this happened on the 20th of Sivan. And among those that were killed were students of the Rashbam. Rashbam was the grandson of Rashi. Rashbam was the older brother of Rabbeinu Tam. And Rabbeinu Tam declared the 20th of Sivan as a fast day, as a day of tshuva, of his day of repentance. I assume that Rabbeinu Tam realized that although this was just the first blood libel in one city, but this is going to be the precedent, as it was, for what will happen in many other towns throughout Europe. Even today, we know that from time to time, many of those who are trying to destroy the state of Israel, they repeat this nonsense about how the Jews use non-Jewish blood to bake matzahs, to make matzahs. So Rabbeinu Tam proclaimed, and I even saw in one source that Rabbeinu Tam said that, although it never happened, that this day, as a day of fasting and as a day of tshuva, will become more important than Tzom Gedalia. Now, but this fast day was never really accepted by the Jewish people. But we see that Rabbeinu Tam, my uncle said, had a different opinion than Rabbeinu Kalonymus, and his opinion was that it is that there are events that took place after the Churban, after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, that deserve to have a day commemorating those events, independent of Tisha B'Av. So my uncle said it seems that there is an argument between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Kalonymus. And by the way, the 20th of Sivan, which was really never accepted by the Jewish people as a fast day, later on, in the Gzeres Tat during Chumensky lived in the 1600s. He is considered a hero today among the Ukrainians to this day. He murdered, they didn't have statistics, but it suggested that he murdered in the course of a short period of time. And they did not have the advanced methods of murder that the Nazis had, that he murdered 500,000 Jews. Much more, many more than were murdered during the time of the Crusades. So the Shach, the Tosfos Yontif, many of the outstanding Rabbanim and Poskim of that time, leaders of the Jewish people, proclaimed, because there was a massive killing that went on the 20th of Sivan. So they reaffirmed that fast day of the 20th of Sivan, and they proclaimed that the Jews, that Jewish women from the age of 15 and Jewish men from the age of 18, I've seen some write 17, should fast on those days, and it should be a day of tshuva, a day of repentance. Some are troubled. Why this difference? And also, fasting is usually from the time a person becomes a gadol, person becomes 12 or 13. So why is it different here? I assume, I might be wrong, that they were concerned about something that was associated with marriage. And at that time, girls got married about the age of 15, and boys got married at the age of 18. So they wanted to proclaim it as a day of tshuva. But whatever it is, again, there were individuals. When the Shach proclaimed the 20th day of Sivan and the Tosfos Yontif proclaimed the 20th day of Sivan, I've read that there were some Dolim that were opposed because they too felt that it should be associated with Tisha B'Av. I read somewhere that the Marsha was opposed to the proclaiming another day, another fast day to commemorate that tragedy. But even though there were more people that observed it than observed it when Rabbeinu Tam established that day, but still it was not accepted by the masses. In the old Siddurim, you'll find slichas that were to be recited on the 20th of Sivan. So the question is, but my uncle said they obviously were of the opinion that you could make a day of commemoration for these tragedies, but that opinion was not accepted by the masses of the Jewish people, and therefore he felt that the accepted opinion was the opinion of a Rabbeinu Kolonimus, that we should commemorate all these tragedies on Tisha B'Av. Now, my uncle was also troubled, though. Why is it that Rabbeinu Tam commemorated the event that happened in one town in Europe, and even though at that point there was no day accepted to commemorate the massacres that took place during in the time of Rabbeinu Kolonimus and during the First Crusade, and my uncle said he was troubled by that, and he did not suggest an answer. If one takes a look at the Igros Moshe, now I'm in my house, I hardly leave the house, and that volume of Igros Moshe I have in shul, so what I'm saying is based on memory. Someone actually had sent me in, I think 2 years ago, a copy of that Shuvah of Rabbi Moshe also. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was opposed to the establishment of a commemoration day of Yom haShoah, and he says even though there were Jews in Europe that observed Chav Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, he says there it was not something that affected all of the Jewish people. It was not something that affected all of the Jewish people. But the Holocaust, and he suggests that the Crusades also was something that the European soldiers was a threat to the existence of the Jewish people everywhere. So he says a local fast day, a fast day for an event in a small area, in one area. He says that you could have even after the Churban. However, an event that has to do with the fear and destruction of all of the Jewish people, and to commemorate it later, that should be reserved specially for Tisha B'Av. I would like to suggest a different approach. And what I want to suggest is that perhaps there is no real argument between Rabbeinu Tam and Rabbeinu Kolonimus. There is no question that on an ideal level, everything that takes place, all the tragedies that take place during the exile period, should be associated with Tisha B'Av. Because there is no question that these events have to do with the Churban. And not just the events that took place over wherever Jews lived, or wherever Jews lived, they felt threatened because of these events. But even the events that took place in one city, in one town, why did Rabbeinu Tam proclaim a fast day? Because of the event that took place in one city. A fast day that he said that he thought would become more important to the Jewish people than Tzom Gedalia. It's because Rabbeinu Tam understood that what happened in this one town will happen in town after town, in city after city. And it was prophetic. Because throughout Europe and throughout the generations, throughout the centuries of our exile, that claim that the Jewish people are murdering non-Jewish children to use the blood in their matzahs, that false claim happened and repeated itself even into the 20th century, and to a lesser degree it's used, not very successfully even today, by the enemies of Klal Yisrael. But I think it had to do more with the perception of people. When it came to the Crusades, the Jewish people understood that the Crusades was not an isolated event. The Jewish people understood that it was part and parcel of the Churban, of the destruction, of the exile. So there was no need to make a special event. However, the event that took place in one town, even though Rabbi Tam was right that this event will have a rippling effect from place to place and from time to time. But the Jews at that time saw that as a separate event. They didn't see that. They didn't perceive that. Perhaps because it was a local event, they did not see that as part of the exile. They saw that as an isolated event. And it's because of this and the impact of that event. If it had been associated with Tisha B'Av, would have had very little effect on the Jewish people who lived in different areas and in different times. And because of that, Rabbeinu Tam felt that it was necessary to proclaim that day as a fast day and as a day of tshuva, a day of repentance, on a different day, on the day of the event itself. However, there's no question that Hitler Yamach Shemo wanted to kill every Jew over the whole world. But unfortunately, many of the Jews at that time, even a universal event such as the Holocaust would have not seen that as part of the Churban. Unfortunately, already there were many Jews who thought that the Holocaust, that the Churban, the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the exile that took place was an event that took place 2,000 years ago. They didn't see it as a contemporary event. And many Jews, unfortunately, did not see the relevancy of Tisha B'Av. And perhaps that was the reason why it was necessary, because many Jews would identify through the Holocaust, through seeing how the Jewish people are viewed by the nations of the world, how we have become the scapegoat for anything that happens. It's always the fault of the Jews. But by focusing on that event, they might come to recognize the significance of the exile and the significance of the Qurban. And the truth is that today, nothing is as powerful in giving Jewish identification as the commemoration of what happened to the Jewish people in Europe during World War II. A matter of fact, I want to just express my own feelings, my own memories. I was born in 1949. My friends, most of my friends, their parents were survivors. Many of them were born in second marriages. When you heard Yisker in shul, people were crying. They were crying not just for their spouses and their parents, but the children from their first marriages that were massacred. People had to be taken out of shul in the middle of Yisker. And when Tisha B'Av came, no one mentioned the Holocaust. The Holocaust in those days, I don't care the stories you hear. History is always rewritten. And perhaps they didn't want to mention the Holocaust because of scared of the effect it would have on some of the survivors, the way Yisker had. But no one mentioned the Holocaust. It was only after Yom haShoah became significant in the lives of American Jews. And when it was initially initiated, it played a big role in Israel. It did not play such a big role in the lives of the American Jews. To some degree, I think they were trying to run away from the Holocaust. But it was only after it became accepted and crowds would come to the synagogues on Yom haShoah that an effort was made, and a successful effort was made to include the observance of the Holocaust, the observance of the event commemorating the Holocaust on Tisha B'Av. And in a sense, as a result of Yom haShoah, Tisha B'Av became a day commemorating not just the Churban, the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, not just an event that happened 2,000 years ago, not just the Crusades, but even the tragedies that took place in recent Jewish history. And I think that for the Jews of America. We have to understand the Jews of America are not the Jews of America is not limited to the crowds that learned in yeshiva. The Jews of America include many, many Jews. Many Jews who, through no fault of their own, have been cut off from tradition. The way they have become, what initiated their Jewish identification, was the observance of Yom haShoah. So I think there is no machlokes. Rabbeinu Kalonymus and Rabbeinu Tam agreed. Rabbeinu Kalonymus said that, of course, the most significant day is Tisha B'Av, but there are times and events that necessitate a special day. And of course, we have to come through that commemoration to recognize what Golus is, what exile is, and what the Churban is. Now, but I do believe that the observance of Yom haShoah as a day, as a day of commemorating the Churban, presents a challenge to us. So I'm not concerned so much about the challenge that it was something that was initiated by the members of the Knesset. It probably would have been better if the Gedolei Yisrael, shortly after World War II, would have proclaimed the day to commemorate these events. Maybe they had special reasons, I'm sure they did, why they thought it was better not to at that time. But since no one was saying anything, and this was the day that was accepted. Whoever initiated. But the fact remains, this was the day that to a large degree was accepted by the masses of the Jewish people. But I think there is a new challenge. A challenge that Yom haShoah did not make did not present itself 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but only today it does. Now, many years ago, somebody wrote an article in one of the Jewish newspapers here in Chicago, in which they compared the Shoah, they compared the Holocaust to tragedies that took place throughout the world with other nations, not with the Jewish people. We know in Asia, when the communists went in some of the countries, they slaughtered anybody that had an education greater than an elementary school education. And someone wanted to compare those things, and those were great tragedies. Someone wanted to draw an analogy between that and the Shoah. And at that time, a member of my shul, Mr. Sander Kirsch, who was a survivor, him and his wife were survivors, he wrote a letter, I think it was to the Chicago Jewish Sentinel, I'm not sure if my memory serves me correctly. And when he says, yes, these were all great tragedies, but in each of these tragedies, there was a reason, not a justification, a reason that they had, reasons that were no good. Either they felt threatened by them, or they wanted to have full control, or they were scared they wouldn't accept their leadership. But in the Shoah, the Jews were killed only because they were Jews. It had nothing to do with anything else. Only because they were Jews. There can be no identification between those tragedies and our tragedy. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be concerned. We have to be concerned about every person who is murdered, and especially when it's mass murder. My father, Zatzal, when it came to these type of matters, he would be considered a liberal. My father was one of, early on, he was opposed to the war in Vietnam. I'm not taking a position now, yes or no. He was vehemently against the throwing of a bomb on Hiroshima. He felt killing civilians was a terrible thing. He told me that when he expressed his feelings about that, he was literally physically thrown out of shuls. There was no person that I met that had such concern for all human life. On one hand, my father was a big universalist. But you know, when you go today and you talk with Jews, even Jews in the Orthodox community, you see Jews who were brought up in Orthodox homes, Jews who went to day school, to Jewish high schools, Jews who went to seminary, girls who went to seminaries. I used to give a share at the University of Chicago, at the Hill over there. And you saw there were all kinds of students who came from non-religious homes that became observant, that would learn. And you had Jews who were observant and came from observant homes. But their political positions were almost anti-Semitic. And the question arises, how do we explain that? People came from rabbinic families, outstanding rabbinic families. How are we to explain it? What was the difference between my father's universalism of every person was created in the image of God and their universalism? My father's universalism emanated from his Judaism. It was from his commitment to Torah. I remember the two people arguing whether my father's liberalism was Roosevelt's liberalism or Wilson's liberalism. I said, what are you talking about? My father's attitude was grounded in the Torah. It wasn't grounded in these people. If he valued human life, it's because the Torah valued human life. My father's universalism emanated from his Judaism, from his commitment to Torah. Today, when we see Jewish people who come from observant families, being the advocates in taking positions against the Jews of Israel, against the Israeli government, those who support the murderers and the terrorists. It's all based on universalism. But their Judaism emanates from the universalism. And this is the challenge that we in the Jewish community have to confront. Yom haShoah is very important. And we have to commemorate the tragedy that happened to the Jewish people in World War II. We have to understand that the Jewish people are always discriminated against. And we cannot let others have our fate in their hands. The Kinnah tells us that during the Crusades, one day they would pay the bishop of the town to protect them. And for one day he did protect them. And the next day he opened the gates and let the Crusaders massacre the Jews. We can feel very comfortable, but we can't feel safe. And I think we can't view Yom haShoah as a day of tolerance, dedicated to tolerance. Because if it becomes a day of tolerance, ultimately even Jews will find fault with the Jewish people, with the Jewish leaders in the state of Israel, and will support chas v'sholom, the murderers that promote terrorism. Yes, Yom haShoah is very important, but Yom haShoah has to remain a day that focuses on the position of the Jewish people in the world, and thereby we will come to understand what Golus is, what exile is, and what Korban is. Okay.
Thank you very much. For anyone who has questions, please write them in the chat, and I will ask on your behalf. Baruch Hashem, we have a lot of people joined, so we unfortunately can't have the direct questions. So if you write questions in the comments, I will ask them for you. One question is, are we permitted to take upon ourselves to fast on Yom haShoah for victims of the Holocaust?
I don't think so, because it's in the month of Nisan. Originally, they wanted to make Yom haShoah as a day of fasting. However, I think certainly today, it's not so much a day of fasting as a day of education. Of course, you could say certain prayers in memory of the Jews that were killed, but ideally, because it's in the month of Nisan, we should not fast this day. Fasting we certainly could do on Tisha B'Av.
Okay, another question is, how do you propose we change commemorations of the Holocaust?
Well, I think the focus has to be change. I don't know what that means, to change. In other words, we have to focus on what was lost. We have to focus on how the Jewish people have constantly been discriminated. And we have to, I think part of it is we see all these nations that advanced in the passage of time. And Germany, you could say Reish Yisrael Amalek, it was the first of the nations. It was outstanding thinkers. My uncle mentioned that when he was in the university, some of those who emphasized in the philosophy department the study of ethics, they became the leading philosophers overnight of the Nazi movement. So we have to understand that what happened, that the relationship we have with certain people on one day, we can't put our trust in anybody, only in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in a sense, having a state of Israel, that in a sense is the idea of the Jewish people playing a much major role in their own future.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Okay, so want to thank Rabbi Soloveitchik for this share, and I want to thank everyone for joining and for participating. I do have another question here.
Sure.
Does the fact that in Israeli law the focus of the day is also to commemorate the heroes and people who revolted against the Nazis, perhaps it makes it inappropriate for Tisha B'Av, which is about mourning? So maybe the Israeli focus, based on their law, it's better for it not to be on Tisha B'Av.
I don't. Where does it say that you
The
can't?
name of the holiday is not Yom HaShoah. It's Yom HaShoah
Yom
B'Hagvura, and they chose
I
this
know.
day because of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Yeah, I understand. Tisha B'Av, in the Kinnis, we talk about the Kohanim. The reason my uncle mentions in the his shiurim on the Kinnis that the reason special emphasis is mentioned about the Kinnis is because the Romans were against the Kohanim more than anybody else. Why? Because the Kohanim were the ones who, at least in the final stages of the fight, he says they broke through the walls, they entered Yerushalayim on the 17th of Tammuz, and it took them 3 weeks to burn the Beis HaMikdash. Okay, they got there a couple days before Tisha B'Av. But the Roman army, that was the greatest army in the world. And the distance between the walls of Yerushalayim, where they broke through, they came in, and reaching the Beis HaMikdash was not that great. So who held them back? It was the Kohanim. So we see that Tisha B'Av commemorates, as I mentioned my father's name, those who died al Kiddush Hashem directly, as well as those who died al Kiddush Hashem because of Ushmeinu Karasa B'Shmecha. Those who died fighting, so their Kiddush Hashem manifests itself in Kiddush Am Yisrael, in the sanctification of the Jewish people, where those who were killed independent of fighting, they died in Kiddush Hashem directly.
Okay. Another question. Is what we're experiencing now, I guess, a fulfillment of what's mentioned in the Tochacha, that we are exiled from our shuls, which is like being exiled from the Mikdash? I don't know.
So I wouldn't call this exile from the shul. I wouldn't identify this with the Tochacha. This is a universal plague. I'll just use the opportunity there are those, it was very interesting. There was a certain Rav, I'm not going to mention the name, who 2 years ago gave a speech where he said the Jewish people, which is true, the Jewish people are different than all other people. But then he went on to say the diseases that affect the rest of the world do not affect the Jews. The Jews have a different body. Unfortunately, that person also got the virus. So what we have to realize is, even though I said universalism is important, but our universalism has to come from our Judaism. We have to know that the things that affect the rest of mankind affects us also. We can't ignore. One time, a certain Rosh Yeshiva said that my father was the only gadol that was concerned about Biafra, concerned about Vietnam, concerned about all these things. We have to be concerned, and I certainly did not imply the reverse about people dying. And we have to be concerned because a life is a life, and every person was created in the Tzelem Elokim. But in addition, we have to realize that everything that takes place in the outside world, it affects us also. And to think that that we can shut ourselves off from the outside world is foolish. And you see today, even those who, in a sense, separate themselves from the outside world, there is a rebellion among their youth. The impact of the outside world is there. It doesn't make a difference where you are. You could be in Chicago, you can be in Manhattan, you can be in Williamsburg, you can be in Square Town, you could be in Muncie. We're all affected by the outside world. And certainly when it comes to physical illness, it plays a role.
Yeah, you did mention that a few years ago in the Haggadah share that living outside of Eretz Yisrael, you get the culture of
That's right.
Galos.
It wasn't. I said that the Rambam says that in the Igros.
Yeah,
That's
and you described right why living in Chutz La'aretz, in the city of all Jews, is worse than living within Eretz
I asked
Yisrael.
that question. That's right.
Yeah, so it's a similar idea, I think, what you're saying
similar
right now.
idea. Exactly. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So I don't see any other questions, but I want to thank everyone for joining in, and want to thank Rabbi Soloveichik for the share. Thank you all for joining in.
Next Sunday. Yeah.
Okay, God willing, we'll have a share next Sunday. Maybe we'll adjust the time a little bit, maybe not. But if we would adjust it, would become a little bit later, not earlier. But we'll send out later in the week the link and the time and the topic. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. Have a good week.